Okay, welcome back everybody. So for this section we talk about population in deep time, going back further than just a couple hundred years. So we will do a thought experiment to start out, right? So there's this thing called DNA, right? We've all got it. DNA contains genes. It's organized into these 23 chromosomes, right? And if we were to zoom in on the chromosomes, which is really just a big DNA package, right? You would see strands of DNA, and you would see these individual parts of it, which are genes, right? Which code for a particular protein, right? The units of it. Let's just imagine, right? So we take two people at random from anywhere in the entire world, right? Could be North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, wherever, right? You compare DNA of those people, right? Just gene to gene, looking at where it's the same, where it's different. You put this into a percentage, right? 10% different, 50%, right? How different they are. Now, you don't just do this once, right? You repeat this 10,000 different times, all right? Taking two people at random, comparing their DNA. Take two people at random, compare them. And the question is, about what percentage difference would you expect, right? If you average it all together, you say, okay, on average, any two human beings from anywhere in the entire world are going to be what percent different from each other in terms of DNA? So the answer is 0.1%, right? Which is far lower than the vast majority of people would expect. Human beings are far more genetically similar to each other than, I don't know, as exists in the popular imagination, which sometimes tends to imagine far more differences than there really are, right? So this is 1,000 black dots here, right? So just as a way of visualizing it, on average, you take two people, you compare them in terms of their DNA. It would be 1 part out of 1,000 that is actually different. Human beings are incredibly similar to each other genetically. Now, you could, if you wanted to, repeat this, right? Do this same thing, but with some sort of other animal group. Pick whatever animal you want. You would find that any two gorillas are far more different from each other than human beings are, right? We tend to be extremely genetically similar to each other in a way that is not seen elsewhere. Now, reasons for this, we'll kind of give the fast-forward version a full-throated explanation of human evolution. Development over time is not what we're looking to do. There is some sort of last shared common ancestor, which human beings branch off of. Gorillas, modern apes, all branched off of at some point in time, some 10 million years ago, right? You have some sort of common ancestor ape group, right? And for whatever reason, right, that group gets split up, right? And some of them go off in one direction and start evolving in one way. Some of them go off in another. Some of them go off in another, right? So one group of this ancestor group, right, goes off and evolves into modern gorillas. One becomes modern chimpanzees, right? One becomes modern Homo sapiens, right? And the reason why human beings are so genetically similar to each other is at least believed to be because of some sort of bottleneck event. That's the term for it, right? There was some sort of event in our history, somewhere about here at the 1 million mark, which essentially decimated human population, right? You had some ancestral group of human beings. They went through some sort of event which was tough, right? And the vast majority of them did not survive, right? But the population that did survive reproduced. And so the original population, right, which might have been much more varied in terms of DNA, goes through the bottleneck event, some sort of event of extreme selection. Surviving population is much more genetically similar to one another as a result, which is what we see with human beings. This is not confirmed. This has also not been ruled out. It is more consensus than not at this point. Other parts of this which are hotly contested is this idea of where this would have happened, right? This process here, right, where you have some sort of ancestral group which splits into these other groups that evolve into, among other things, modern apes, modern human beings, right? It is strongly believed that this happened in Africa for a number of reasons, right? It's essentially not contested by anybody at this point that it would have been in Africa. However, where in Africa and exactly how that process took place, there's no consensus on that. I will give you the version that is most often repeated, which is that human beings would have been in one sort of ancestor group in East Africa, right? And over time branched out into Europe, through Asia, right, to Australia and North America as some of the last places where human ancestors would have immigrated. Notice, right, the number of years on this, right? So this is 150. KYA is just an abbreviation. That means thousands of years ago is what we're looking at here, right? So 200,000 years ago, some sort of ancestral group in East Africa branches out into the rest of Africa shortly afterward. This part is hotly contested, whether it started in one part of Africa or whether it was the so-called Pan-African, right, for the whole continent. We'll just say for our purposes, human beings start in East Africa, and concentrated group, go to the rest of Africa, and then to Europe, South Asia, right, eventually into North America from there. Ethiopia, right, is the country we looked at that most closely occupies this sort of ancestral environment, right, of human beings. This is a picture of what it looks like today, and it has the features that we would want, right? Warm climate, lots of fresh water, rainfall, ways of transportation, lots of variation in terms of the environment, biodiversity, good ways to grow food, right? We noticed, right, when we talked about biodiversity, we talked about how having lots of hills and valleys contributes to a higher ecosystem biodiversity as a result. And that is exactly what you find in the so-called rift valleys, right, of this part of Africa. So fast forward version, tectonically that part of it is ripping apart, right? We have plates which are splitting apart from one another. Volcanoes form here as a result, as well as a number of extensional features from this part of the world being pulled apart, like these rift valleys. Right? Now, another question which we haven't directly tackled yet or talked about. How do populations tend to change over time, right? So, this is true for all life across all domains, right? Life reproduces, makes more of itself, wants to do that, right? We can imagine just as a sort of analogous example, right? We have a single bacterial cell, right? And it reproduces and makes 2 after 1 day, right? And then both of these reproduce to make 4. All of these 4 reproduce to make 8, right? And 16 and 32, right? This is an exponential increase in population, provided that there's enough food to support this process, right? Enough nutrients and energy to support the really costly act of reproduction along the way, right? And what does this look like in the context of human beings? Well, human population over time follows this exponential trend. The graph on this one is absolutely striking, I think, right? So notice, this is human population for the entire world put together, right? From 10,000 BCE, roughly when agriculture was developing, right? Stone Age, all the way to today. You'll notice. So at first, population of the entire world is about equal to what's in Maricopa County today, right? And on this kind of scale, right, the increase is very gradual at first until you reach the modern era, right? 1850, 1900, 1950, and then exponential growth, right? Absolute explosion in population in this very last part of the human timeline, right? So there are, as a result, far more people alive at one time today than have ever been before, right, at any time in human history, right? Notice also, right, life expectancy is very low, in part due to infant mortality, in part due to those issues of infectious disease, malnutrition, right? Nowadays, globally, much higher, right? Far more people living for far longer, far healthier these days. Another way of visualizing the same thing, right? So we go back to deep time, right? Ancient history, right? Stone Age. Very, very slow, but still exponential increase. And then somewhere in the modern era, right? Maybe 1900, starts to absolutely explode, right? And go up exponentially. Other thing on here that is important. Black Plague is basically the only event on the entire timeline which alters this significantly, right? At least as far as recent history goes. Notice that World War II, as disastrous and impactful as it was, didn't do much to impact this at all, right? Infectious disease here, pandemic, was the only one that did, all the way up into the modern age. This is one more way of looking at that same data, right? So we have got the annual growth rate of the world population over time, right? So this is how fast it is getting bigger. Not how many people there are. This is the growth rate, right? Which spikes in the baby boom era, post-war, declines sharply afterward, and is expected to go down all the way to 0. Population explodes, right, a little bit after where the growth peak is expected to level off. And we said that population growth is ultimately a temporary phenomenon, the best we can tell. It's part of what is meant. And as far as projections here, nobody knows what the future looks like, but as we said, right? Even other events like the Black Plague and World War II were not enough to fundamentally alter this curve. Okay. We can ask this question, right? So looking at a graph like this, right? So what percentage of all the people who have ever lived are alive right now? And I would encourage you to think about this for a moment. So this puts it into perspective, right? So this is all of the people who were alive before right now, right? This is our number of people who are alive right now. So it's something like 7%, right? And this is the number who are in US, UK, and Canada, right? It's kind of a stunning figure, right? 100 billion people who have ever lived, ever, right? It's a lot of people. And then 1/7 of them are alive today. So far more of them in the past than right now. Final thing for this section. We talked about human beings moving into North America. So the idea on this one, right? So we have our ice age, right? The most recent pulse of this ice age, right? Essentially what happened is all of North America up down through here was like Greenland, covered with this massive ice sheet that comes in and scrapes everything off, right? And then starting about 11,000 years ago up through about 7,000 years ago, this starts to recede, right? It starts to melt, things start to get warmer. It is believed that human beings migrated somewhere around this time, 11,000 years ago, through a land bridge, right, over the so-called Bering Strait from Russia over here into North America and became the ancestors of modern-day Native Americans and others, right? Another way of visualizing the same thing, right? So this is the so-called Bering Land Bridge. Exact timing on when this would have opened up and exactly how is not known, but it's the right story, we'll put it that way. So we have our continental ice sheet, right? Ice age comes down, starts to recede, land bridge opens up, people migrate into North America and become the ancestors of modern Native Americans. And that's where we're going to leave it for this idea of population in deep time. Next, we look at population as an object of academic study in the bad way.